So I just want to fly through it, and people can hear it as they're sitting down. So you can start me whenever you're ready. If I'm mind coming through.
You are.
Okay. So start me whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker. You probably have heard of him before, Bradley Kuhn.
So first of all, I want to thank my co-organizers for allowing me to speak. I submitted a talk to our own track, and then I said, well, we should accept other people instead, and I'm conflicted out from my own talk, referencing Karen's talk this morning about conflict. So they discussed it among themselves, and I submitted this as a 55-minute talk, though, because it does take 55 minutes, because it's a complex story. They gave me a 25-minute slot initially, and then I didn't want to do it, because it's actually, if you don't do a lot of public speaking, I'll tell you, it's actually much harder to give a short talk than a long one, as it turns out. And then we had a cancellation. So then I ended up with the full 55 I wanted. So I've been well treated by my co-organizers. So that's saying as a speaker. Speaking again as an organizer, I want to teach a phrase to people at FOSDEM. Full means full. I have been fighting people out there in the hallway all day who are insisting to come in when it's full. And I even had someone come up and say, "I'm a lawyer, you have to let me in." And I said to him, I said that sounded pretty strange, and it was when John Baptiste was speaking. And then he said, "There's probably no lawyers in there, and they need a lawyer in there on that topic." And I said, "Actually, the entire first row is lawyers in there right now, and just because you're a lawyer doesn't mean you can come in." So we went back and forth for a while. I finally sent him to the registration desk and said, "Well, go tell the FOSDEM people that you were upset you couldn't get into a room that was full." I later told the folks up at the Knock Center with the FOSDEM organizers this story, and they said, "I really hope he runs into Philip Papes and says, 'I'm a lawyer, you should have let me into a full room.'" And that's a conversation I think we'd all want to see. So I hope that's what happened. Yeah, if your friend's in here, it doesn't matter, and so forth. Those of you that have seats, the move-in thing that I keep saying, do that. I see that's not happening. There will be people out there who want to come in, and so use empty seats, use all empty seats, and make it easy for people coming in. All right, so enough about FOSDEM politics, of logistical politics, I guess is what they are. Most of you know me as the person who does the GPL enforcement thing. And you've probably seen me give talks about Linux GPL enforcement because, after all, they're the most prevalent violations that exist in the world right now. And I've given a talk in previous years about why Linux is such an important GPL project now and so important with regard to enforcement. But in fact, GPL violations come in all shapes and sizes. Not a month goes by that I don't get someone telling me something about a GPL violation or enforcement or a GPL battle in a community that I hadn't even heard about because the GPL is so widely used. And this story is actually a very different sort of violation that inspired a really different resolution than the typical enforcement. I'm sorry, the glare keeps making it hard for me to see that. And so I'll start by telling something that most of you in the room probably know, but just in case a few of you don't, those of you that don't can go to sleep or read some email for a few minutes. The basics of how GPL enforcement work is that GPL in V2 and V3 both require that the whole work be licensed under the same license. This is the idea of copy left, because it requires that when you add stuff to the work, the license remains the same. And for most free software projects, this means not just that it has to be GPL'd, but it has to be under a GPL-compatible license. And that's important, and you'll see even more important in this particular story, why that has to be true. And most developers look to the FSF for the GPL-compatible list and so forth. And probably most importantly, the key copy left requirement in my view is that both licenses require that the complete corresponding source code, the whole source code to that work that is therein licensed under GPL, be made available in various different means to people who receive distribution of the binaries. Now, I could easily give a whole talk on any of these topics. We could spend an entire 55 minutes talking about what it means to have the whole work license. So this would be what some people call the derivative works debates. And if you go back 2 years in the archives of talks in this dev room, or 3 years now, you'll hear a talk from Till Jaeger about the question of derivative works under EU copyright and so forth. So that's a hotly debated topic. And in my world, the CCS requirement is also hotly debated. Because from my point of view, I feel that that's the most important thing I'm most worried about most of the time because it's the most often violated. There's usually source code missing from the work. But if you're new to all this, and I'm talking about stuff you've never heard of before, go with some assumptions. The people who have heard me talk before are going to disagree with this slide probably, but let's assume for the sake of the rest of my time before I take Q&A at the end that there are requirements in GPL regarding source code disclosure, that everyone might have their different opinion about the whole work and what is the whole work, and that in fact there's relatively limited guidance on this, and if you're going to have a fight about what a derivative work is under copyright law as it relates to GPL, or what the whole work or combined work is under copyright, you're probably going to end up, if you're going to get a serious dispute, in a court battle over it. There's another assumption that I think actually exists in the software world, and this is the really disturbing one to me. Because the fact is that everybody pretty much assumes that you can make more money with proprietary software than you can with free software. Now, it doesn't really matter if that's true. I actually think it probably is true, because anytime you have more options and more power, you can usually extract more from the people you subjugate. So it would seem to me that you can make more money with proprietary software, but it doesn't even matter if it's true or not, because people perceive it to be true. So when people come to the free software world from the general population or from the proprietary software industry, they're going to look and say, this is the way I make money in the software world. In fact, I experienced this just on the way here. Richard Fontana, who's very sick today, unfortunately, in his hotel room, and Tom Marble and I sat in a Delta club. Karen wasn't there because we have incompatible airline differences. She's in on American Airlines. But we three on Delta are sitting there in this Delta club because we paid way too many frequent flyer miles to get into this, this swanky clubs they have at airports. And this guy hears our conversation. And finally, he jumps into it. We're talking about free software politics and how do you make money, usual stuff free software developers talk about. He jumps in and says, well, he points at me. He says, well, if you want to dumpster dive and work for a nonprofit, that's fine. And I mean, if you like that lifestyle, good for you. Keep dumpster diving. He said dumpster diving 4 times, actually. And he told Tom not to get a job or something like that because you wouldn't be happy. Or, this guy's like, and I used to work for Oracle. So there it comes. And that's the way you make money in the software industry, he says. So this is what people believe who are business people about software. They're going to believe they can make proprietary software, and that's how they're going to make the most money. Now let's talk about developers as opposed to business people. My belief is even proprietary software developers, and I have an anecdote about this one too, if left to their own devices doing what they want to do, they actually want to share their code. And this is always true, that when it's convenient, developers always tend to just share code with each other. This is why free software operates so well, because they just share by default. Even when it's not convenient, developers tend to share code. I met Masayuda, who is the founder of the Free Software Initiative Japan, in 2001. And he told me that throughout the 1990s, he knew that he would be successful advocating for free software in Japan, because every engineer he knew in Japan would go to lunch at least once a week with some colleague who was a developer at another company. And in almost a spy style, they would each pull a floppy disk, this is the 90s, remember, out of their pocket and sit it on the edge of the sushi bar. And they'd eat their lunch and talk. And when they left, spy stuff here, now they'd swap floppy disks. Now, of course, these floppy disks had whatever most interesting software they happened to be working on that week that they wanted their friend at Sega to see, but they worked for Sony and they couldn't actually share it, so they shared it by bringing back the wrong floppy disk from the sushi bar. So that's anecdote and other things I've seen convince me developers prefer to share. And I'm not trying to say that you're all software freedom zealots like me, because most of you aren't. I was called, Jeremy called me a scumbag today. Andrew Katz called me a radical arm of the FSF, which, I mean, how am I more radical than RMS? That I don't get. But I think what developers tend to do is, if all things being equal, they prefer to be sharing their code. And that means the way you exercise that these days is you, by default, release it under free software license early and often if nothing's stopping you. And this is how the story starts. It starts as a rather basic type of free software story. Some developer had an idea and said, well, there's a lot of proprietary software out there for code hosting sites. And I really looked at the free software alternatives. They aren't very good yet, so I'll write my own. So if you think back to June 2010, Bitbucket is proprietary. GitHub was and still is a proprietary thing. And by the way, it only supports Git. So if you're a Mercurial fan, you can't do much with GitHub. Fabricator, which is Facebook's throw-it-over-the-wall code hosting software, hadn't even been released yet. And GitLab didn't exist yet then either, although now it exists and is free software, but only supports Git. So it wouldn't have helped him anyway. So this developer says, I'll make a little Mercurial code hosting tool that you can host your repositories and comment on diffs and all the usual stuff you do on these types of sites, and puts it up and posts to Mercurial's mailing list. Excitedly, he's put it under the permissive MIT license. But it's a free software mailing list, so immediately a flame war starts. And they're arguing about whether or not he can put this thing under the MIT license because it's based on Mercurial in the usual derivative work, combined work sense. He's taken the APIs of Mercurial and put them together with some webhooks and put up a little web thing. And so back and forth they argue about this. Now, the thing is, finally, I think it was Matt McCall, because he's the voice of reason in the Mercurial community, came in and pointed out that he actually can license it under the MIT permissive license since, as the FSF says on its website, the licenses are compatible, which means the license of the whole work is GPL, but you can have components incorporated in that are under non-copylefted permissive licenses, and those components, if they're properly noticed and continued to maintained under the non-copyleft license, you can pull them out later, et cetera, and so on. Usual stuff that most of you in the room probably have read if you're familiar with licensing. So the developer, on his own, this thread's raging on, and Matt's already said this, but the developer says, I like the GPL anyway, so I'll just put the GPL on. I have no problems. I like the GPL. I'll put it on. And this builds a community over a period of years. In the really traditional, old-school type of free software community that I grew up in and still tend to like. Many developers, as volunteers, start contributing to this code base, and there were actually developers being funded on independent contracts to work on the free software. I'm really a big fan of free software written by lots of groups of small independent contractors, companies that have 5 to 7 employees, that kind of community, as opposed to the big corporate stuff that we heard about from Stefano. I'm a fan of the small stuff with lots of collaboration. So I think this operates really well. I think this community was operating really well until this project, now named Rogue Code, decides to form a company. And of course, because they want to confuse everybody, like everybody who gets a .io domain, that's both their name of their company and their name of their software project, sure enough, they name the company Rogue Code, and that's what the code is called as well. Now, I'll call it throughout the talk the company because that's easier than trying to say Rogue Code GmbH, which my colleagues in this project I'm going to talk to you about often note that I say GBMH instead of GmbH. So I'm just going to say the company, that way I won't get it wrong. It's the equivalent of Inc. in my world in the US, but I'm a person who grew up in the US, so I screw things up all the time. So the company just announces, hey, we're going to change our licensing scheme for Rogue Code. So it's going to be under the GPL Plus, and we're going to put the GPL Plus in quotes there, not GPL Plus like you would normally say. And they add some code. They add some Python code that says, well, and you can only have 20 users logged in at once. Now, of course, that code's under the GPL itself. So immediately somebody writes a patch that they say, well, I can write a patch to take out the 20 user limit, and under GPL I'm allowed to distribute this patch under the GPL, so I will. And there's a lot of community backlash. The fellow who wrote that patch out to patch out the 20 line thing, there was like actually 200 lines to make the maximum user limit. He gets attacked by the company, and they say they're going to sue him. And meanwhile, there's kind of a disaster going on. Now, and I'm going to show you the license, this GPL plus other things license in a minute. But as this starts raging on, Conservancy is contacted, the place where Karen and I work, the Software Freedom Conservancy, because Mercurial has been a member project, actually one of our earliest member projects back to 2007, 2008 timeframe. And while the Conservancy doesn't hold the copyrights on Mercurial, in fact, the majority of them are held by Matt McCall, the chief maintainer, the Rogue Code code base is infringing his copyrights because it's based on the GPL work that he had released and made a new combined work out of it. So he wants us to do something mainly to deal with this community thing that's sort of boiling up in the Mercurial community and its side communities. So some of those developers, especially ones being attacked by this company, sort of want Conservancy to do a very traditional GPL enforcement action like we normally do. Get the lawyers in, get aggressive, and sue them if we have to, that sort of thing. And as Conservancy always does in all compliance matters, despite what you may have heard to the contrary, we go for calm conversation, give the fullness of time to try and find a resolution. So we have a number of conference calls with the company and try and figure out how we solve this problem. In this series of conversations, the company makes it abundantly clear that they hold 100% of the copyright in the code and therefore have the right to change the license any way they want. Now, this becomes a problem for two reasons I'm going to tell you in a minute, but it makes the situation quickly a standoff. Now, it's not that you can't release old code under a different license. This has been a classic thing that people do. If you hold 100% of the copyrights on a GPL program, you can issue a new license tomorrow that's not GPL, and this is how you get proprietary relicensing business models and the like. But the question was about the future copyrights of the company, because can they actually relicense new things they add under non-GPL terms? And it's really a complicated question for two reasons. The code base is GPL'd already. First of all, going back to the original flame war on the mailing list, the thing is based on Mercurial in a derivative/combined work sense. So it has to be GPL, not because of anything road code has in it or anything the company wrote, but because ultimately it started from a GPL code base, namely Mercurial. But the second problem is as the road code project had been built, like a normal free software project, it accepted contributions from the community under the copyrights of the various people that had contributed. So for two reasons, it has to be GPL'd, and they can't put further restrictions on it. They don't agree with this, so we spend months trying to have this conversation and get nowhere. And it became clear we weren't going to solve this with friendly negotiations. So we have to think, what are the other options? Now, it's quite common in my experience that this is the moment of complete impasse in a GPL enforcement action. And it's where we stand with many of the Linux enforcement actions now, because we can do nothing but sue, and there's really no option left but sue. When you have a free software community that's tried to enforce the GPL, and the company says, we will not give you the source code. We will not give you the complete corresponding source code for this work. In the Linux case, we have this proprietary device driver we refuse to release under the GPL. And if you think we have to release it, which of course we do because it's part of the work called Linux, well, I guess you're going to have to sue us, they say, if you really want us to release that. And so that's why in many of the enforcement cases I've been in, a lawsuit becomes abundantly necessary at the end. But this is not that type of violation. And here's why. It's important to remember, and I've told many of the people who have been involved in the situation this company was initially a good actor. They didn't start out bad, they just became that way. And they had shared with the community a tremendous amount of software under the GPL, which is a very kind and helpful act to the world. And because of that, because that code base exists, remained useful, and was of interest to developers, it meant that we had a different type of resolution available to us that is not typically available in a more mundane or common GPL enforcement action. Specifically, we could fork. And I hope people get the kind of irony of this slide, right? People think of forking a GPL project as a way to have conflict. It's usually considered a way you fight with some other community. In this case, doing a fork was the best way to avoid a conflict with road code. And here's why. We've done plenty of GPL litigation at Conservancy. We've probably done more than anybody except for Harold Velta, who did quite a bit but doesn't do it anymore. So eventually we'll probably catch up to him. And we know well that lawsuits are the last resort. We try very, very hard to get compliance without suing someone. And when you actually do a lawsuit, you actually don't get a resolution right away. In fact, I predict that it will take a very long time to get a resolution on this question of the Linux device driver problem that I've been working on already for about 5 years before I turn my full attention to it. And it'll probably be another 10 before we truly have resolved the situation. And we will succeed, of course. The thing you have during that period is complete confusion, which is what we've had in the Linux community for basically ever regarding proprietary device drivers, proprietary modules. And if you look at other examples in the proprietary software world, which I remember the BSD case because I'm old, there was a time when BSD's code was unusable because everyone just didn't know whether it was under the BSD license anymore. Because BSDI had taken it, made a proprietary fork, and USL, which was the sort of, at that moment, the entity that held the old AT&T copyrights, said that BSDI was infringing. And they had a lawsuit about it, and it got settled, and ultimately the sort of remnants of the old Berkeley system got released. It became BSD, I guess it was 3.4 or whatever it was, and now we have just a plethora of BSD communities that are writing free software, which is great. But there was a period of 18 months where nobody did anything because no one knew the legal status. But thanks to that earlier GPL release that we could go to and look at and say, we know this is under GPL, Conservancy had another option and had a way to keep the community alive quickly. Well, relatively quickly compared to the time it takes to do a lawsuit. Now, here's where we have to start looking at the details. What exactly did Rogue Code do? What is this weird GPL, quote, plus, unquote, license they tried to release Rogue Code under? Well, it's ambiguous. Here's the text. You can read it. If you know what it means exactly, please tell me, because I've talked to multiple lawyers about it, and nobody knows exactly what it means for sure. But we quickly saw a really easy solution that might work, because Rogue Code was under GPL v3 or later, there was a existing clause in GPL v3 that could probably help. In fact, the GPL community, FSF in particular, was well aware how commonly people try to do things such as, this is GPL except for military use, which is forbidden. Well, of course, that's a contradiction to the GPL because, while I don't like military use of my software either, I know the GPL allows it. And if you put that next to the GPL, you basically have a contradictory license because you've got, I give you permission to do that, and then I don't give you permission to do that at the same time. GPL v3 added a section to allow the downstream recipient of the code to take care of the problem yourself. You can literally rip away from the license notice anything that is a contradiction with GPL. This gives a tremendous amount of power to users. I love this clause. Everybody's afraid to exercise it because they know that if they yank that extra clause out and redistribute, they're asking for a lawsuit, which they'll have to spend years in court arguing, just like in the other situations I mentioned, figuring out whether that it was actually an additional restriction or not. Now, that would make some interesting case law for us to work in the GPL world, but it wouldn't solve the problem we were trying to solve, which was get the community who is interested in this code base working on the code again in a way that's under a true free software license. So we knew they would fight that claim, so we didn't do it because we wanted to make peace. So we didn't chase that route, even though it looked like an easy solution. We decided, in fact, to read this thing more conservatively than necessary. I truly believe that that allows me to yank that whole part 2 away. I really believe that in my heart of hearts. I think I'm permitted to do that. However, we took it seriously anyway, just to avoid conflict. And we said, well, OK, what does this say? Well, the Python code, definitely GPL'd, no question. Integrated HTML, definitely GPL, because section 1 of this weird thing they gave us says so. So then we just have to look at what to do about the CSS, images, design, that sort of thing. What do we do about that? So that's where we went from there. To go from there, we had to do a 5-step process. And I'm going to talk about each step in detail. And I've been moving fast up to this point because I'm going to slow down here. So I know I'm speaking a little fast as a native English speaker. And those of you that aren't have been like, why is he talking so fast? I slow down here because this is where we get to the heart of what we did. These 5 steps are how we got done the thing we needed to get done. I want to start by giving credit. I did probably the bulk of the work up to the step 4. Everything after step 4, I've done almost nothing. I've got Bugs assigned to me, I ignore. I'm a horrible member of this community now. But up till step 4, I did most of the work. But I have to identify a couple of volunteers who did a lot of work. I'm going to butcher his name because I'm famously for mispronouncing European names in this European meeting. But Mads Kiederik, I hope I got it right. He's done so much work on this project. He's still its primary maintainer now and so forth. And there were a couple of others who did a lot of work during this period. Now, I'm just talking about who helped specifically for these 5 steps. Sean Farley did a tremendous amount of work. And actually, Andrew, are you in the room? There you are. I couldn't find you. Yeah, so Andrew is here, and he did a tremendous amount of work on this. And I'm actually kind of a little nervous giving this talk because he knows some of these details better than me that I'm about to cover. So you can shout, Andrew, if I get something wrong. So we decided we're just not going to do this enforcement through Mercurial. And therefore, if we weren't going to do enforcement that said, you have infringed the copyrights of Mercurial, therefore, Conservancy's Mercurial member project is going to come after you for GPL enforcement. We decided, as I've explained, that wasn't the route we were going to go. Well, if we're not going that route, what is Conservancy's existence in this community at all? We had to actually consider whether we should have this project. The project, when we evaluated it, it originally came in as called the new project, which was very confusing. But we didn't have a name for it at that point. I'll tell you the name soon if you haven't. Actually, I forgot I put it on the slide, right? So it wasn't called Calithia yet, which it was named later. But we had this project that was unnamed that was gonna be a member project at Conservancy. Because if it became a member of our organization, if you saw Karen's keynote this morning, you know about how we take these projects and they become part of our organization, and then we're able to act on their behalf. We become, as Karen said, the we for that project. So that's what we had to decide to do for this new project that we were going to make. So we offered membership, but there was a tremendous amount of debate, actually. You heard Jeremy speak earlier today. He serves on this committee. He's also on the board of directors at Conservancy. So why you call me a scumbag still, I don't know. But anyway, so many people in this committee were really worried, right? Because they didn't want to invite a lawsuit from this company. And they really are the ones, the evaluation committee laid out the remaining 4 steps that we had to do. They said, you've got to do this work this way if we're going to take this as a member project, because we want to be pure as the driven snow. We want to have this company to have no reason whatsoever to take legal action against us ever. So this first step is we've got to identify when was the last time the thing was under GPL v3 proper, without any of this weird stuff. Well, that was pretty easy because it was in revision control. And in fact, until just recently at this point, which is now a year and a half ago, the revision control system was still public. It's actually not anymore. But the revision control system was right on Bitbucket, so we were able to clone it using Mercurial and just take a look. And so we find exactly when they patch in that extra text on top of the GPL. So we know when it came to be. And we also noticed that the maintenance branch for the previous release never got this patch. So it's only living in this beta branch that they were working on version 2. And so the beta branch is the only thing that's in any way suspect, in any way needs extra vetting, because the other stuff has the regular pure GPL on it. So, all right, step 1's done. What's next? Oh yeah, I just mentioned that. Sorry. Basically, the material in the beta branch was going to be considered for later, and the material in the maintenance branch was fine. Forgot a hash line on that. Sorry. So in step 2, we said, well, we don't want to just take this maintenance branch, right? Because 1.7.2 was sort of a static release, and they started doing new interesting things. It was sort of the impetus of why they wanted to semi-proprietarize it, because they thought what they were doing was so wonderful and great, and they wanted to, because they believe that you can make more money by being the danger and making your stuff proprietary. So we said, well, what can we take? What in the beta branch can we take? Well, if you look back at that, remember back at that license, it said that Python and HTML code clearly were under GPL. Even if you take their new license as legitimate, which of course it is not, you say, OK, we can definitely take that stuff. So the first thing we did is how do we extract just the Python and HTML that we know we can take? We can take all of it if we want it, because it's all GPL v3. And actually, Mads deserves the credit for this idea. He said, well, let's not just start playing around in the repository, like commit and change it and take something and, oh, we couldn't take that, put it back. Let's make sure that the entire repository history is pristine. And when he mentioned this, I said, yes, you're absolutely right. We have to do that because we don't want any intermediate revision to be infringing copyright. Now, as a GPL enforcer myself, or as a license enforcer myself, I'd never worry about like if somebody had an infringement like in the middle of a commit because they did something wrong and then they fixed it, like they forgot to put the guy's copyright notice there and then the next commit puts the guy's copyright notice back. I mean, that's totally reasonable, happens all the time. But if somebody really wanted to be mean, they could say, well, because I can check out that repository and go right to that commit, you're distributing this thing and this revision out of compliance. So we decided, actually, every single revision in the entire history of the commit log has to be on its own in compliance, every step of the way. Of course, you can't get that all right on the first try. It's not humanly possible. So we wrote this shell script that would rerun all the extractions, and then we'd look at the output, which was a whole repository, and check to see whether each revision, step by step, was in compliance with the GPL. So here's an example of the kinds of commands, and all this is public now. It wasn't public at the time. We sort of did this clandestinely till it was done, but we made our repository with these shell scripts in it public. So this is the kind of thing we did, right? So what this is doing here, if you're not a Mercurial, I had to learn a lot of Mercurial for this, and I'm still kind of more in a Git brain than a Mercurial brain. What this is basically doing is saying I've got two repositories. I've got the road code repository and the Calithia repository. And what I'm doing here is doing a diff between these two revisions. So that sort of looks somewhat like Git for those who know Git better. And the I's are saying include these files, and the X's are saying exclude. So we wrote a lot of commands like this to both do two things. One is make sure we're only getting the Python and HTML. And the second is throw away stuff we didn't want. And I can't remember why, but for some reason we didn't want this particular Python file. So we could have taken that, but it wasn't useful, so we left it aside. That sort of thing. But notice, like, for example, we're throwing away these templates. Well, of course, we're going to assume they might not be licensed under GPL, even though we think they are, but we're going to throw them away because they might give us a hard time about it. So what I did is I would run these scripts over and over again and vet every single patch and see if it was just taking Python and HTML. And therefore, if it was clearly in the clear, no problem. And anytime I ran into an edge case, we discussed it with legal counsel. And obviously, I'm not going to waive Conservancy and the Calithia project's attorney-client privilege to tell you any details of those conversations. But quite often, I was chatting with our general counsel, Tony Sebro, about various details to check what he thought about various different copyright issues as they came up when we did that. The next step we did is we had to rename the project. And I'm glad Pam's in the room, Pam Chestik, who gave a very good talk last year about some trademark issues, because this is a really interesting example of something she was kind of talking about last year. I don't think it was exactly in her talk, but it was sort of hinted at, which is that you can still use the name of a trademarked company, and as long as you're doing it in the ways that the trademark law provides for. So you can say things like, this is similar to Calithia is similar to road code. It functions very well with road code. You could say all those kinds of things and not infringe trademarks. But we wanted to be extra careful here, right? Because we're trying to avoid conflict. So we had to go even further in some cases than what trademark law strictly would have required. And it's also true that picking a new name was hard. I mean, this was probably the most contentious discussion internally in this community about what to name this thing. And Andrew, do you remember who actually came up with this name? Was that you? Me. Yeah. So Andrew in the room came up with this name. Well, you played the negotiation very well because you waited for people to not have any good ideas. Then you suggested Calithia. Andrew is a very good free software politician. I didn't even know how good until just now. Yeah, very good move. So anyway, so he came up with this name. And it's a classic kind of thing like Fedora does, where you make a weak connection to the name you're connected to, but there's no real trademark connection of any kind. I don't think it's trademark infringement that we happen to pick a locality in Rhodes, is it, Pam? Yeah, give me legal advice on the spot, Pam. No, I don't. It's OK. But I think Pam would agree that that's not a problem with trademark. But there was another problem. So like programmers tend to do, all over the code, there was road code underscore, particularly in like database table names and that sort of thing. And so I think, and maybe I'll waive a little bit of attorney-client privilege here to say that the Trademark Council doesn't advise you that you have to remove every reference to a name, particularly when it's for compatibility. So if the database wouldn't work, between the two, i.e. you have tables named road code underscore, and if you call it something else, the databases aren't compatible between the two applications, we'd have a really good argument that we needed to leave the name road code in just to make it work. And again, it's in the source code, not in any of the marketing or public materials. You actually have to be a programmer to find it. Those sorts of arguments, I think, would have worked. But we ended up deciding to take this hyper-conservative approach. We decided, look, we can remove this. We can give a database conversion script. It's not that hard. Let's just be conservative, because we're not looking for a fight here. So let's be conservative. Now, anytime somebody comes to you and says, oh, yeah, it's really easy to replace strings in a code base, because they're just strings after all, it's harder than it looks. It really is. We had lots of cases where we weren't generating working code anymore, and we did replacements because the sed and Perl that we'd written was wrong. And there's actually, in the scripts, you can go and check them out, of the Mercurial repository. I think it's called Calithia Meta, because it's the meta stuff we used. But yeah, it's a lot of weird stuff like this that we had to do to sort of make sure we weren't changing the wrong stuff or changing it in the wrong way. So it even runs off the screen, because these were so messy and nasty. Now, I'm a Perl. Anything that's said in that script, Mads probably wrote. Anything that's Perl, I probably wrote, so that you can tell where it came from. Of course, the logs are there, so you could just do an hgdiff and see who wrote it, or hgblame, rather. So the next thing we really wanted to do, and I really want to slow down the most about this because I think it's the most interesting part of the talk, is we wanted to be stalwart in our compliance. We wanted to be somebody people could look up to about how well we complied. And the reason we wanted this is that we knew this company had violated the GPL in plenty of ways. I mean, after all, there were third-party copyrights that they relicensed under this weird license. And ultimately, they're going to be, and probably still are to this day, because it hasn't been that long since this fork, the largest single copyright holder in the work. Conservancy has some copyrights now that I generate. I have some personal copyrights in there. Andrew has plenty. Mads has tons, and so forth. But the company's got a lot of copyrights. So even if we just went ahead and did the right thing and assumed they did the right thing, they could come after us for their own GPL violations. And I'm going to talk about that a little more in a few minutes. But more importantly, Conservancy is known as an organization that cares about the compliance with the GPL. Now, one of the things that I've started saying, it's sort of a new point I've been trying to get across, is that compliance with the GPL is a bit, not a discussion, right? Either you've followed every term of the license and you've fully complied with them, which means you get a 1, you're in compliance, or you missed one, any one, and it's a 0, you're not in compliance. It's not like you can be almost in compliance. You can't. You're either in compliance or not. But what you can be is you can be just doing the bare minimum. And I have to tell you, you only have the 15 pieces of flair. Do you really just want to do the bare minimum? Because your colleague over there wears more pieces of flair, and we encourage that. So we want to wear as many pieces of flair in our compliance as possible. We want to make sure that the complete corresponding source code is the best possible complete corresponding source code it can be, something that we should hold out as a beautiful, pristine example of good compliance. Now, the problem was it wasn't easy to get it right because of JavaScript, more or less. I am on an education campaign to convince people that JavaScript is nothing to do with the Affero GPL, nothing to do with kind of, the cloud and it's hosted and therefore it doesn't distribute to you and so forth. JavaScript is probably one of the most mundane mechanisms of software distribution there is. You put a JS file on a URL, people download that URL with an HTTP request, and it's been distributed, or in GPL v3 terms, conveyed to that user, period. They received a copy. It's straight old GPL, just like you gave it to them on a CD. No difference whatsoever. And the fact of the matter is that because GPL, unlike the Affero GPL, triggers primarily on distribution, every JavaScript file doesn't just get distributed to those who check out the Mercurial repository or clone the Mercurial repository, or otherwise distribute Calithia as a whole. Every single user gets a copy of the JavaScript. Well, if some of the JavaScript is GPL, you got to figure out what the whole work is and make sure that they have an offer for source and a copy of the source for the whole work. I remember the morning when I did this command, or a similar version of it. I made it full so you could run it yourself, and said, oh my goodness, I thought this was a Python program. There's JavaScript. And that's what I learned about, before I go to the next slide, really the amount of cargo cult that people who are primarily authors in non-JavaScript language do with JavaScript. All right, first of all, that's jQuery. I know what jQuery is, right? I mean, of course, we all know what jQuery is. But why is the minified version of jQuery sitting in your repository? But why is the non-minified version of CodeMirror there? And as I look through, I realize, actually, in some of these cases, the original upstream developer, who was one of the employees of this company, just randomly grabbed various different Git checkouts, not even releases of these JavaScripts, copied the file over in his own repository with no history, and added it. So I had to go back upstream and find all this stuff. So in this case, I at least found it was from a real release. CodeMirror version 3.15 is what was used. But then I had to go back and make sure, is that the version upstream? Because, of course, it had no license information on it. I didn't know what license it was under. I had to go find out, OK, if it's a byte for byte the same thing I got from upstream, I know what the license is and can trust it. It's this MIT permissive license and so forth. So I can extract it in here and commit it and put it in the repository and make sure the commit log actually tells me where this came from. I am pretty sure I'm the only person who's ever bothered to do this for a JavaScript thing that was cargo culted into a larger application. And you should all start at least doing this. I don't think the cargo culting is a good idea, but at the very least do this much when you cargo cult it so you remember where you got it. It's just, I can't understand it. It's like, just copy it there and add it. I mean, that's what everybody else does. It must be right. Anyway, this bothers me. The other thing I did is, I mean, I think the commit log's just fine. I mean, I fully believe, as an expert in copyleft, that when you put something in a commit log and you explain where something came from in the commit log, you have met the attribution requirements, the other types of necessary things you have to do for a copyleft license. I know some people who claim to be copyleft advocates get out there and say that there's some weird extra stuff you have to do other than the commit log. They want you to put weird statements in attribution, and they might accuse you of plagiarism or something like that. I mean, I don't understand it, but I think this is enough. But doing a little more is always useful. Like in this case, what we did is we threw it in the license MD file and actually said, oh, CodeMirror is in this thing. If you're finding this here, you got it from other places. Oh, really? A 5? My thing has 14 on it. Why does that? Sorry, you're definitive. OK. So what I ultimately did was say, well, why don't we go back and compare it and do this? Now, the problem is the minified stuff. I have to speed up now because I thought I had longer than I do. I was 10 minutes off, sorry. So the minified stuff's a real disaster. Because, in fact, GPL v3 talked about minified JavaScript. This is from the rationale documents of the FSF. They intended it to be the case that if you minified JavaScript, I think it's true under GPL v2 as well with the words preferred form for modification. But in this case, it's abundantly clear that if you have minified JavaScript, if the thing's GPL'd, you have to get the source code. Now, this thing was a complete disaster. It turned out that this YUI thing was a version of Yahoo's interface library, a bunch of JavaScript they released. Version 2.9 is what Calithia and Road Code originally, then Calithia depended on, and it was deprecated. And I searched the internet for this deprecated version. I found minified versions everywhere. Well, they didn't have a problem because they were using it under the 3-clause BSD, which as long as they kept the copyright notices in place, they could make it minified. But in my case, it's part of this larger GPL'd work, which means I need the full, complete corresponding source code and so forth. Now, it's not to say that distributing the minified JavaScript in your repository is a problem license-wise. I think it's a problem technologically, and you shouldn't do it. But as a license-wise, you can do it, because nicely we have this section of GPL v3 that works well. But you also need to give the information about build and how to install and all the things that make CCS, of how to actually compile the thing to the minified version. So we quickly came up with this thing that worked, and it generated a minified version. I don't know why Ian's laughing hysterically. He'll have to tell me later. But this works, and this is compliance, because it doesn't the CCS instructions don't have to be nice, and it's OK if they make Ian laugh, as long as they work. Now, I should note that GPL has a certain amount of minutia that you have to deal with. These terms are easily met but you really kind of have to build a checklist. Even pilots who fly every day, they do a checklist before the takeoff. And when you fly home, be glad they do that, because it's been studies have shown that pilots miss things that they've done a million times if they don't have a checklist to find it. And this stuff in GPL v3, which I think is very good and has good intent, becomes a little bit menacing when you have an unfriendly upstream. And I've experienced this in multiple projects, not just this one. Occasionally, unfriendly upstreams get a little obsessed with attribution, and they want to try to catch you in failing to attribute properly. And it turned out road code had one of these pages that displayed all the copyright notices. Well, we had to have one too, because back in this section, it says that we have to maintain them forever all the way downstream in perpetuity. I'm going to talk to RMS. I think maybe in GPL v4 this should be a little looser somehow. I'm not sure how. Because when you have a unfriendly upstream, you got to worry. They might keep coming back to you. They might keep calling on the phone screaming at you about not having their attributions right. And you might not be able to please them so easily. So in this case, we really wanted to make sure that we could get it right with Calithia so that we never got any of those phone calls from them, and we didn't. So this is what, and this actually has probably been added to, Andrew, I bet, since now. But at the time when I did finish my work on this, this was all the copyright notices we had to display, because road code doesn't display all these. But they should have, because they were all people who contributed to their work. And in fact, they didn't even have their own copyright notice in this page. They had other people's. But we put theirs in because it was already there, and the license requires that it be accurate. So it gets annoying to maintain these separate, because now we have it in the contributors file, and we have it's about the HTML we have to maintain forever. OK, that's my last slide, so hopefully Tom won't be too mad at me for still being on the stage. I mean, this JavaScript thing, you know, if you do any web development, just stop doing this, please. Save the world. Don't do this. And I think one of the things that was interesting about the whole trademark part is nobody asked in that old road code thread, like what the developer's named Marcin was doing with the name, who owned it, what he was doing. And some people were surprised when all of a sudden there was this business guy he was working with that was doing all this weird stuff. Because everybody still, I think, likes him as a developer, but his business partner, well, you know. So finding out who controls the domain, who controls the name is really important. And so, you know, if it's one person, they should really get with a nonprofit like Conservancy to move forward. And the next thing is really to keep your own copyrights on your work and be willing to do GPL enforcement. If it weren't for Matt McCall having the copyrights on Mercurial and being able to stand up and say, this is a problem, I want to see it fixed, Conservancy couldn't have done any of this, because that was the leverage we had to push us through to be able to do that. A couple of great things about Calithia, and then I'm done. It's self-hosting. You can go to Calithia and develop Calithia on Calithia. It's under active development. We have one of Calithia's active developers in the room. I don't count myself as one anymore. It supports both Git and Mercurial, which a lot of these tools don't. So you can use both. And it's completely developed in the open. True free software project, public IRC channels, public mailing lists, public patches, everyone's welcome. And a great thing I just learned at LCA last week is that there is a PEP in the Python community that CPython might be hosted on Calithia. The decision is going to be made in next May. It's Calithia versus GitHub, so we'll see how it goes. But I hope it'll happen, and I'm excited about it. So there's a bunch of links and URLs, and I better get off the stage because I don't want to take away from the next speaker. Oh, I can take 5 minutes of questions. OK. Thank you. So how did I have 5 minutes left 10 minutes ago?
You really only have 3 minutes right
OK, go ahead.
You mentioned a GPL checklist. Do you have a GPL checklist for us?
Yeah, it's called the text of the GPL. It's on every Debian system in user common licenses. I mean, this talk is a start, right? If you want to write one and contribute it to this, I unplugged it already, but if you contribute this copyleft.org guide we're working on, I think it would be a great section of the guide. And if you want to write it, that too is a free software project. So I'm going to put this back in so you can see the URL. But come to copyleft.org and contribute. Am I out of time, or are you asking a question? You can ask me later. I can get somebody else. He's one of the co-organizers. Yeah.
What was Root's code response to all of that?
OK, he's same question. Absolute silence as far as we know. Andrew, have we heard anything from them? No. They made a bot that stays in our IRC channel and presumably logs it, but that's the only response I saw. I think they realized we did everything right. Now I'm giving talks about it. And if they think we did something wrong as far as compliance, I'd be love to have a conversation about them, but I'm pretty sure we got it all right. And so we're doing what we're allowed to do under the GPL. There's not much they can do about it. They have a proprietary product if you want to go buy it. I think it's violating the GPL, but you can use Clithia now, so ignore it.
And it's not publishing new sources.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all.
Last year.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah.
Someone asked about the checklist with the GPL compliance. FFmpeg has one on their website, but it's more specific GPL there.
Yeah, but yeah, like I said, I mean, read this whole guide, and if I mean that's not in checklist format, but it has almost everything in it. And if you wanted to make a section that is a checklist, I'd take the patch for sure. And you could start with my talk slides and make a checklist out of that. That'd be great. Someone do that.
You should read the GPL and incorporate it in your own release checklist, which you have one of, right?
Any more questions? I have to get off the stage, I think. Yes? OK, one more question, Tom says. OK. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, in the world of Perl, dual license is pretty common, both GPL and statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Hypothetically, if a project gets forked and splits the statistics license, and it's only GPL, which is perfectly legal, and then starts going after users of the original code base for not making something valuable, what can happen?
I mean, I think your defense is you argue the artistic license back against them. I mean, that would be the similar way. I mean, Larry designed that licensing mechanism because he expected people to do that. He expected that times when there was confusion and debates about GPL, like we see here, that people would just argue the artistic license as their answer. Now, if they fork it under GPL only, add their own stuff, and you're infringing there, well, you're violating the GPL. But you can't take permissions away from people with free software licenses. They're irrevocable. They're designed to be that way. And we had a court case about that in the US called Jacobs v. Katzner that makes it pretty clear that's true. OK, I'm off the stage, I think. And please enjoy our next speaker.